Out past the last cell signal, beyond the paved roads and tourist trails, the Appalachian Mountains stretch on, ancient, silent, and watching. These mountains have seen generations come and go, and they hold on to their secrets. Hunters, hikers, truck drivers, and locals all tell the same thing in different ways. Something out there doesn't want to be found, but doesn't want to be alone either. Tonight's stories come from people who cross the tree line and experience something they can't explain. Strange figures moving between the trees, voices where no one should be, creatures that knew their names, and paths that led somewhere they never should have gone. So turn off the lights, get comfortable, let the dark settle in, and relax as these stories unfold. This is Beyond the Tree Line, and these are true Appalachian Mountain encounters. About half a decade ago, something happened to me that I still struggle to explain. I'm a lifelong West Virginia resident, comfortable with wilderness living and self-sufficiency, but no amount of mountain experience could have prepared me for what I encountered. My family inherited a modest mountain cabin generations ago. It's basic, nothing you'd want as a permanent residence, but maintaining it feels like honoring my grandparents' memory. Living in the city means I can only visit occasionally, usually just long enough for essential repairs and quiet reflection. 6 years back, my employment situation shifted dramatically. I started working a compressed schedule, half the year intensely busy, followed by 6 months completely free. The timing wasn't perfect. All my time off fell during the coldest months, but after years of continuous work, I welcomed the break. Winter availability meant extended cabin stays, fixing accumulated damage while enjoying peaceful evenings with books beside the fire. I looked forward to hiking familiar trails when weather permitted. Driving up that first day, I felt genuinely content. The initial 2 weeks tested me. The cabin's condition had deteriorated worse than expected. Frigid nights and multiple leaks during rainstorms forced repeated town trips for supplies. Gradually, I made the place livable. Despite the exhausting work, I enjoyed the solitude. The isolation felt therapeutic rather than oppressive. Nothing seemed unusual during those first weeks. Everything felt normal and predictable. Then, one afternoon, returning from a supply run, things changed. The outdoor air carried that sharp bite signaling approaching bad weather. Opening the door, I encountered an indoor chill nearly matching the outside temperature. Strange for a space sealed all day. I initially thought I'd left the door unlatched, but the lock was secure. Inside appeared unchanged at first, matching the mess I'd left. Then I noticed a single damp glass on the counter. I clearly remembered washing and drying all dishes that morning, leaving them inverted by the sink. I stared at that glass, searching for explanations. After a full day hauling materials and driving mountain roads, I didn't want to create problems from nothing. Exhaustion seemed the likely culprit, so I dismissed it. Still, the atmosphere felt wrong. Walking through felt like entering spaces just vacated. After checking everything twice and finding nothing else disturbed, I convinced myself cold air was seeping through unpatched gaps. The cabin had so many openings that I joked it breathed more than I did. I tried moving past it. I built a fire, made dinner, and settled with my book. The flames quickly warmed the space, and within hours, crackling wood and burning scent had me fully relaxed. The book exceeded expectations, and mountain quiet made concentration easy. Temporarily, I forgot about the glass, the cold, the watched feeling. Near midnight, I heard what sounded like a cabinet door slowly opening. The sound wasn't loud, just that soft wooden shift from moving hinges. I froze, book in hand. Seconds later, it repeated, clearer this time, from the bedroom direction. That earlier unease crashed back heavier than before. I wanted to blame settling wood or draft-pushed hinges, but I knew this cabin's every sound. This wasn't one of them. The following silence felt worse, deliberate, like someone waiting me out. I know it sounds odd, but that's exactly what I felt. Oppressive, intentional silence. I grabbed a kitchen knife and searched systematically. Bathroom, bedroom, closet, underbed crawl space. By the time I pulled down the attic ladder, my hands shook so badly I needed to pause before climbing. The attic held only my grandfather's old trunks and boxes. Searching didn't take long, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of invisible company. My logical mind kept repeating there was zero evidence. Eventually, that became enough to partially calm me. I considered sleeping in my car, but knew the temperature drop would make that miserable. I convinced myself isolation was playing tricks and returned to the couch, acting like nothing happened. Reading wasn't possible, so I started a downloaded movie on my phone. It worked better than expected. Within 30 minutes, anxiety faded enough that exhaustion took over and I fell asleep without realizing. What woke me was facial heat combined with sudden panic. I jerked upright. The fireplace still burned strongly, flames high enough to throw moving shadows across walls. When I'd started the movie, the last log had been nearly consumed. No fire should have remained. Then I saw them. 2 fresh logs burning in the flames. Someone had added them. Someone had moved around while I slept mere feet away. My body reacted before my mind caught up. I stood so quickly I nearly fell. That's when I saw him. He sat at the couch's far end, completely still, posture rigid. Firelight dimly illuminated his face, eyes fixed on flames like he hadn't noticed me wake. I can't describe the next few seconds. Everything blurred. Shock, cold terror up my spine, overpowering flight instinct. I don't remember if he looked at me, spoke, or moved. My next clear memory is my hands on the steering wheel, already halfway down the mountain. As soon as I got signal, I called the police. Breathless and probably incoherent, I explained everything. The dispatcher sounded doubtful, but agreed to send someone. Officers searched the cabin in under 10 minutes. They joked about drinking, drugs, mental health history. Every word made me feel smaller and more foolish, but nothing changed what I saw. They found nobody, no forced entry signs. They left acting like I wasted their time. I left right behind them, hearing one laugh before their cruiser door closed. I haven't returned since. I don't know who he was or how long he'd been there while I slept. I don't want to know. Even now, I check every room before bed. Some nights I lie awake wondering what would have happened if I hadn't woken when I did. I've spent most of my years somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, shifting between small towns and roads barely marked on maps. Out here, weather controls everything, and the land has moods you either respect or suffer for. I've always appreciated that balance. Isolation, quiet, the world's honesty this far from civilization. I've weathered storms, outages, washed out roads, encroaching wildlife. None of that ever troubled me. What did trouble me was one particular night that still occupies space in my mind whether I wanted there or not. It should have been a simple, harmless cabin weekend, something I'd done countless times without concern. Instead, it became one of my most disturbing nights, the kind that makes you reconsider your safety regardless of woodland familiarity. That night, the storm hammered the ridge well before sunset, the kind making every tree moan and every gust shake the cabin like it's cardboard. Town friends had planned a 2-day visit, nothing elaborate, just quiet mountain time, but they called before 8 saying they weren't coming. I understood. Driving those roads with near zero visibility would be reckless. Still, disappointment hit harder than expected. I'd looked forward to company for once, but instead faced another night worrying about property. Living here offers more advantages than drawbacks, but the drawbacks, when they appear, can turn dangerous quickly. Flash floods, landslides, falling trees. Each incident costs money. After eating, I checked security cameras hoping to see outside. I couldn't. Rain was so heavy the lenses showed white fog. I tossed my phone aside and started a movie I'd watched probably 500 times, my go-to when I'm too wired for silence and don't want to think about what's bothering me. Maybe 30 minutes in, I heard knocking at the front door. Not dramatic, just solid knocking, but every muscle went on alert immediately. Out here during a storm, on a night like that, nobody knocks. I have no neighbors, and I'm far from any trail. If you hear knocking in this isolation, something's wrong. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the front entrance feed. Nothing. Not even a shadow. I approached the door quietly, looked through the peephole, and saw the same thing. Nobody. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it, but the sound had been too clear. I tried shaking it off and headed to the kitchen for water. That's when I froze. Pressed against the kitchen door window was a man wearing one of the most disturbing masks I'd ever seen. He hadn't spotted me yet, but I watched him gently tugging the back door handle, testing it, like he was seeking a quiet entry. My first thought, he'd knocked on the front to distract me while circling back. Then another thought hit just as fast. What if there were multiple people? I ran to the bedroom, grabbed my gun, and rushed back toward the kitchen, ready to frighten him off, or worse if necessary. But when I got there, he'd vanished. I checked every door and window, then double-checked. Everything was locked and solid. After that, I sat watching camera feeds like my survival depended on it. The storm was so intense, even motion-detecting cameras weren't catching anything except rain sheets. I kept watching anyway, barely blinking, trying to convince myself he'd left. 30 minutes passed without a single sound, and I finally started thinking the guy had given up. I was seconds from calming down when I heard glass shatter upstairs. It was sharp, fast, loud enough to cut through the storm. He was inside. It didn't initially make sense because every upstairs window was reinforced and double-paned, solid enough that breaking through would have made far more noise. Then it hit me. The small roof window opening into the attic. I hadn't thought about that window in years, mostly because the attic had been shut off. Not just shut, literally sealed. When I ran upstairs to confirm my suspicion, it was almost relieving to hear his footsteps pounding up there. It meant he hadn't reached the actual house. Years earlier, when I first bought this cabin, I got it far cheaper than it should have sold for. Town people whispered stories about it. Footsteps heard at night. Claims that anyone living there long enough died because of some vengeful, trapped spirit. I didn't believe that nonsense. I thought I was getting a bargain. But truth is, during those first weeks, I learned the hard way something actually was wrong. I heard footsteps at night. Not usual creaking wood, but steady, deliberate steps. One night, I woke in full panic, convinced someone stood in my room. I opened my eyes and saw a shape in the corner. A dark, hunched shadow disappearing the instant I turned on the light. I knew I wasn't imagining it, so I called a local woman people swore by, someone who supposedly dealt with this stuff. The moment she stepped into the attic, she told me flat out she couldn't remove the spirit. Said it wasn't wandering the house like a ghost. It was attached to the attic, bound there, angry. The only real option was trapping it inside so it couldn't spread elsewhere. She told me to line the doorway with salt and silver and keep the attic permanently shut. I did everything she said, but I'm naturally suspicious. I didn't trust that salt and metal would contain something like that. So, I hired someone to seal the entire attic door with cement. After that, I still occasionally heard footsteps, but I never had a real problem. Until that night. The man outside must have entered through the only unsealed entrance, that tiny roof window. I heard him pacing like a trapped animal, frantic footsteps racing back and forth. Then suddenly a short, muffled sound cut through the floorboards. It wasn't exactly a scream, but it was sharp, startled, almost panicked, the kind of sound someone makes seeing something unexpected. I didn't know what he'd stumbled into up there, old beams, loose boards, pitch blackness, but whatever it was scared him badly enough that I heard him scrambling toward the roof window again. Within seconds, I heard him climbing out the same way he entered. A couple of thuds, then nothing. But storm. I stayed awake the rest of the night listening to it move around above me. Whatever lives in that attic paced back and forth for hours, heavy steps dragging across beams like it was unsettled by what happened. A couple of times I wondered if it might have slipped out through the window after the guy escaped, but the noises never stopped. It was still up there, still trapped. Maybe the silver lining on the window frame actually worked. I don't know. I'm not an expert in any of this. I just know that whatever was in my attic stayed where it belonged. I still don't know what's in this house with me, not really, but I do know one thing. That night, for the first time since I moved in, I was actually grateful I wasn't alone in here. What I'm about to describe happened approximately a year ago, right as winter began. I remember it was snowing that night, and driving those roads always made me nervous. I live in a remote Blue Ridge Mountains area, but work at a gas station right off one of the busier highways. I won't specify exactly where because I'm still employed there. Like I said, that night brought snow, and I still faced a 42-minute drive home. I was working the first night shift, so I didn't leave the station until around 2:30 in the morning. It had been a relatively calm night until a man entered and was extremely unpleasant toward me. Initially, he attempted small talk like they all do, then moved to commenting on my muscles and making remarks about my body. I told him repeatedly I wasn't interested, that I had a girlfriend at home, and that he clearly wasn't my type. But he wouldn't stop. The more I resisted, the more he insisted. At one point, he grabbed my wrist, trying to pull me toward him. I barely had time to reach for the gun I keep under the counter. He smiled disgustingly, but finally walked out. After about 5 minutes, I relaxed again. After all, I was bigger than him, and I was armed. I didn't think about it again until my replacement arrived and asked if everything had gone well. I was going to tell him initially, but then figured it wasn't worth it, and just smiled, telling him to watch out for creeps. Walking outside, I saw 3 vehicles, my car, my coworker's car, and a work van farther away that appeared empty. It had been a solid 45 minutes since anyone had entered the gas station, which struck me as slightly strange. Still, I didn't give it more than a couple seconds thought. I got in my car, the cold was breath-stealing, and headed home. Even with tire chains, the late hour and low visibility turned what should have been a 42-minute drive into over an hour. Arriving home, I wanted nothing but a quick shower before collapsing into bed. Until that moment, I hadn't noticed anything wrong. It had been a night like any other. But while showering, I heard a noise that startled me. It came from inside the house, sounding like something breaking, though I wasn't certain. I stayed completely still for several seconds, heartbeat accelerating while I tried listening carefully. After a couple of minutes, I calmed myself, assuming it had been my cat, Mia, knocking something over. Only stepping out of the shower did I realize the bathroom door was closed with her inside. It couldn't have been her. I finished drying off and dressing. Leaving the bathroom, I went through rooms one by one to identify what could have made the noise. The air felt tense, and even Mia seemed tense, as if ready to see something she absolutely didn't want to see around the corner. Her fur was puffed up, reacting to every tiny sound. The house felt darker than ever before, even with lights on. Entering each room brought this overwhelming sense of isolation, a feeling that wasn't inaccurate at all, considering I was miles from the nearest house. Downstairs, right at the stairs bottom, I saw a broken vase. That must have been the noise I'd heard while showering. I didn't believe it had fallen independently, but I desperately wanted to believe it had, that it had simply been too close to the edge and slipped. I kept moving slowly through the house, arm hair standing straight. Then I saw on top of the couch a set of clothes. I don't know how long it took me to process that someone was naked in my house. I only know it shocked me completely because of how bizarre the situation felt. I didn't need the clothes to know exactly who it was, but how could he have followed me if I hadn't seen a single car behind me the entire drive? I peeked out the window. No car on the street, and I was completely isolated. More than scared, I was furious. I grabbed Mia, mostly afraid that creep would hurt her, then ran to the bedroom for the gun I kept there. I didn't know where he was. The last thing I wanted was a confrontation, especially with him naked. I also didn't know if he was armed. The moment I stepped into the room, heading straight for the gun, I knew where he was. He was in the room with me, shoved into the closet. The closet door was slightly open, barely pushed in. Walking in, I saw something shift inside, just slightly, as if he were adjusting to the surprise of me entering suddenly. Everything clicked at once. I was going to outsmart that creep. At that point, I knew he didn't want to confront me. Otherwise, he would have already. He wanted to catch me vulnerable, asleep, without thinking through a plan. But knowing I had one, I grabbed my phone and pretended to call a friend, supposedly someone about to drop something who would take about 10 minutes to reach my house. That would give me just enough time to lock the guy inside the room and call police without him suspecting anything until too late. I grabbed the comforter from the bed, the gun, and the AC remote, then walked out of the room and locked it behind me. Mia was much more relaxed now, as if she could feel my calm. The moment I locked the door, I set her down and turned the air conditioning on full blast, freezing cold. It was like everything had lined up perfectly. That wasn't my normal room. It was the storage room with no windows where I didn't keep clothes. I suffer from migraines, and sometimes they get so severe I can't handle any light. That windowless, stimulus-free room is ideal, and I'd been sleeping there about 3 days because I'd recently had a really bad migraine. I hadn't switched back to my main bedroom yet simply because I was lazy and hadn't changed sheets. On top of that, the closet in that room held my parents' belongings, things meaningful to me that I didn't want to discard after they died. The only bedding in that room was what I'd brought out, meaning he was naked in a windowless room in dead winter with AC blasting ice-cold air. It was a tiny room, so in less than 5 minutes it would feel like a freezer. That night is both the scariest of my life because of how bizarre the all was, but also one of the nights I'm most proud of myself, knowing that in a moment like that, I not only kept a cool head, but managed to outsmart him completely. I waited a full 5 minutes before calling police. I wanted him practically frozen when they arrived. But after 5 minutes, he was already screaming, begging me to open the door, running around the room trying to stay warm. I don't think I can fully express how entertained I was. When police arrived 33 minutes after I called, things got even better when I told them what I'd done. The older officer even said that in all his years on the job, he'd never encountered a story like that. The man was taken away, first to the hospital to stabilize his temperature, then to the police station. The trial is still ongoing, but I know he won't be getting out soon. And the best part is that every time he sees me in the courtroom, I can see a slight tremble in him, like he's afraid of me. I believe even if he walked free tomorrow, he wouldn't have the guts to get near me or to harass anyone else ever again.
That trip haunts me more than I care to admit, even though years have gone by. I've tried burying the memory deep where I keep things too overwhelming to process, but it resurfaces constantly. It started as nothing more than a casual winter getaway, a handful of friends renting a mountain cabin in the Appalachians before ski season peaked. Just a chance to disconnect, relax, and create meaningless memories that only mattered to us. Marcus's family had owned that property for generations, a modest, aging cabin nestled in West Virginia woods, surrounded by ridgelines that felt simultaneously peaceful and claustrophobic, depending on how far you wandered. They visited multiple times annually, and Marcus always described it like some sacred sanctuary where nothing bad ever occurred, a place where he'd spent childhood winters skiing poorly and drinking terrible beer with cousins who never judged his frequent falls. We reached the cabin late Thursday evening, exhausted but enthusiastic. Friday's plan was straightforward: wake early, grab quick breakfast, and spend the day skiing the smaller slopes behind the ridge overlooking the property. We were foolishly overconfident, too accustomed to acting without consulting weather updates, too busy laughing and tossing gear around to notice our phones had been sending notifications since the previous night. Only later did I grasp our irresponsibility, how none of us had bothered checking the weather advisory, clearly warning everyone in that region to stay home because of a severe snowstorm expected by late afternoon. We convinced ourselves warnings were always exaggerated, that conditions wouldn't be that severe, and that worst case, we'd return early if wind became annoying. By the time we had boots on and took our first awkward runs down the slope, the morning felt innocent. The sky was bright in that winter way where everything appears sharper and colder than reality,
and I remember thinking how fortunate we were to have the entire day acting foolish without witnesses. Around noon, though, something shifted, and not just the weather. Sharp pain shot through my ankle after a bad landing. Even trying to brush it off, I knew immediately something was wrong. Walking felt incorrect, like every step made bones grind slightly out of alignment. I told the others I'd return to the cabin. Since we were still close enough to the ridge that I could see the cabin roof through tree patches, it seemed like an easy, uneventful downhill walk, taking no more than 40 minutes if I didn't push it. The plan was simple. I'd get back, rest my foot, warm up, maybe make tea, and wait for them to return within an hour or two maximum. Nothing about that sounded threatening. Nothing felt like the beginning of something I'd still be thinking about decades later. Reaching the cabin, I locked the door behind me, more from habit than caution. I remember how the indoor silence felt heavier than usual, like the storm had already started pressing against walls long before first flurries appeared. I spent the next hour limping around, trying to familiarize myself with where everything was, since I'd never stayed there before, opening drawers, cabinets, and closets, just to distract myself from how strangely uneasy I felt being up there alone. It wasn't fear of the woods or isolation exactly. It was more the awareness that I lacked the experience the others possessed, that I wasn't accustomed to places where nearest help was miles away, and phone signal came and went like breathing. Marcus had the satellite phone in his pack, so if something happened, I was stuck with regular cell service that only worked when it felt generous. Snow began falling harder outside, sticking to window frames and piling against porch railings, but I kept assuming they'd return soon. Then an hour passed, then another. I watched light fade behind the ridge, watched the forest grow darker and heavier. The more I stared out the window, the more I felt a cold I knew wasn't coming from the broken weather strip under the kitchen door. I tried calling them, texting, refreshing the signal, holding the phone in the cabin corner Marcus said sometimes caught a bar or two. Nothing went through. Wind was starting to howl, not violently yet, but enough that I kept glancing at the tree line and imagining shapes moving between branches. By the time night truly hit, I was nearly sick with worry. My thoughts kept cycling through identical scenarios, one of them slipping, another getting lost, all of them stuck in the storm with temperatures dropping fast. I tried reasoning with myself, telling the logical part of my brain they were experienced enough to handle this. But truth was, the storm was worsening fast, much faster than expected, and the silence in that cabin felt like weight pressing into my lungs. Around 8 p.m., when I'd already convinced myself something horrible had happened, my phone buzzed, startling me hard enough that I dropped it on the couch. It was a message written at the edge of whatever signal he must have caught. They'd gotten caught in the storm. Visibility had disappeared in minutes, forcing them to descend the mountain toward town rather than attempt making it back to the cabin. They were safe, but they'd have to stay there overnight. He included a rushed explanation of cabin basics, where firewood was kept, which switch controlled the backup generator, where emergency blankets were, though I'd already found most of it while nervously pacing earlier. Knowing they were safe should have calmed me, but instead it made me realize I truly was spending the night alone in that cabin with no stable outside connection and no real experience surviving conditions like that. I kept telling myself it was fine, that it would become a story to laugh about someday, that nothing bad actually happens in places where families spend decades skiing and drinking hot chocolate on weekends. Still, I made sure all windows and doors were locked, lowered shutters, and double-checked every latch. Then I started a fire, sat close enough to feel the heat, and tried not to think about how large the corner shadows felt when flames flickered. But I miscalculated the firewood. I told myself the log pile beside the hearth would last longer, that I'd grabbed enough earlier while inspecting the cabin, but less than an hour later, the fire was shrinking, crackling softly as the last logs burned down. I knew how quickly temperature could drop once fire went out. With the storm building into something loud and relentless, the idea of letting the cabin get cold felt like a mistake I couldn't afford. So I convinced myself I had no real choice but to head out to the woodshed for more. The woodshed wasn't far, maybe 40 or 50 feet from the cabin, Still, the moment I opened the door, wind felt like a chest shove, sharp and thick with snow. I held my flashlight low to avoid blinding myself with reflection, kept my hood tight around my ears, and moved as fast as possible without slipping. The shed was barely more than a small, crooked outbuilding with wooden walls that looked patched and soft from decades of storms. I shoved the door open, stepped inside, and breathed out the first semi-calm breath. I filled my backpack with as many logs as it could handle, counting seconds in my head and telling myself I'd be inside by the time I reached 50. But when I swung the shed door open to return to the cabin, my stomach dropped so fast it made me nauseous. The snow outside wasn't smooth anymore. There were footprints, deep, fresh ones, and I knew instantly they weren't mine. For a moment I stood frozen, my breath fogging so hard that it felt like hyperventilating. Then my body moved on its own. I stepped back into the shed and shoved the door closed, locking it with a rusted latch that looked more like an inconvenience than actual protection. My heart was pounding so violently I could feel it in my fingertips. The footprints were too big, too heavy, spaced like someone walking slowly, deliberately. There was no reason for anyone to be near that cabin. No neighbors, no hikers, no random passersby. If someone approached in a storm like that without calling out for help, they weren't there by accident. I lowered myself to the small cracked window and peeked through the glass. At first, I didn't see anything through the white blur of the storm, but then a shape emerged near the back of the cabin. A man dressed head to toe in winter gear, with some kind of headlamp creating a pale light circle around his face. He was testing the rear window frame, as if checking for weaknesses, moving slowly and methodically, never once looking up. I had no idea whether he knew I was in the shed, but the thought that he might have seen me walk out earlier made my skin crawl. I breathed as quietly as possible, holding frozen air in my lungs until it hurt. I knew those shed walls wouldn't protect me if he decided to come in. Anyone determined could push through rotten wood with a few good hits. I kept thinking about what he was doing, why he was testing windows instead of knocking, why he didn't call out or shout or try to speak. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that whoever he was, he didn't want help and he didn't want shelter. He wanted inside. I waited until he disappeared from my line of sight before I tried to think logically, which was almost impossible with how hard my hands were shaking. If I was going to make it back inside the cabin, I needed to leave the shed without him seeing me. But when I looked again, hoping he'd moved deeper into the storm, I saw him appear suddenly near the front of the cabin instead. Either he was impossibly fast, or there were two of them. I couldn't tell through the darkness and wind, and the uncertainty was worse than the danger itself. My mind kept replaying every horror scenario I'd ever heard about remote cabins, strangers, and storms that erased all sound. He was testing the front door now, pulling at the handle, pushing his shoulder against the frame. Even through the wind, I could hear the faint thud of his weight hitting wood, and I felt my pulse spike so high I thought I might pass out. I ducked fast to avoid being seen through the window, crouching low enough that cold from the shed floor seeped straight into my bones. I had no plan, nothing besides the desperate desire to stay alive, and the fear that every second I stayed there made it more likely he'd check the shed next.
What I'm about to describe occurred more than 15 years ago, but it's something I still think about annually, especially in December when I end up making the same drive where it all unfolded. I'd been on the road for nearly 9 hours, driving from North Carolina up to West Virginia to spend Christmas with my family. It was a trip I made almost every year, usually without incident. But that afternoon, weather reports had started flashing warnings about a sudden winter storm pushing across the mountains. I saw the alert while already halfway through the state. Instead of doing the smart thing, pulling over somewhere safe and waiting it out, I convinced myself I could beat it. I kept thinking about how close I was, less than 2 hours from home. I told myself it would be foolish to stop now, foolish to pay for a motel when my own bed was waiting. That decision, which felt small and harmless at the time, turned into one of the biggest mistakes of my life. The deeper I drove into the mountains, the darker it became. The sun dropped faster than expected, swallowed by clouds that looked like they were tearing across the sky. It wasn't even snowing heavily yet, but the wind was brutal, violent enough that I could feel it pushing against my car's side, shoving me a few inches across the lane whenever I passed through exposed highway stretches. Every time the road curved around an open ridge, it felt like I could lose control entirely. My hands were locked on the wheel, knuckles stiff, stomach clenched. I kept telling myself to turn around, go back the 40 minutes to the last little town I'd passed, but I knew 40 minutes in normal weather meant more than an hour now, and every mile I drove deeper into those mountains made going backward more impossible. But driving forward didn't feel much more possible either. I'd put myself in a corridor with no exits. It wasn't panic yet, not at first, but every old story I'd heard growing up about people freezing to death in their cars started pulling at my mind's edges. It's not an uncommon fear if you grow up in a place like that. You hear things. You learn what can happen to people who make stupid decisions on winter nights. I was one of those people now. By the time the sky went fully black, snow had thickened into a steady curtain, and I'd slowed to a crawl. I'd long since given up trying to track the road by any kind of visibility. I was following the vague glow of my headlights against guardrail edges and praying I didn't drift too far. Eventually, I had no choice but to pull over completely. I checked my phone again, still no service. I cursed myself repeatedly, genuinely angry at how arrogant I'd been. I'd put off buying a satellite phone for years, even though I drove through remote areas all the time. I'd convinced myself it wasn't necessary, convinced myself I knew these mountains like the back of my hand. I sat there in the dark, heartbeat thudding in my ears, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do. The wind rocked the car. Snow piled slowly around the tires. My mind kept circling the same thought. If this car dies, I die with it. I was still staring into that pitch-black road when faint lights appeared far behind me, headlights cutting through the storm. I've never felt relief hit that hard. It was like every nerve in my body jumped awake at once. But right behind that relief came a sliver of doubt. Out here, people are careful, suspicious. Most drivers don't stop for strangers in storms, not because they're cruel, but because they've learned to be cautious. And if this car passed me by, I didn't know what I'd do. Still, I wasn't letting the chance slip by. I forced my stiff legs to move, opened the door, and stepped out into the storm. The cold slapped me instantly, but I waved my arms anyway, hoping, begging that the driver would notice. To my shock, the vehicle slowed immediately. It was a big truck, clearly made for winter roads like these, and the driver lowered the window as he pulled up beside me. Something felt wrong with him the moment I saw his face. Not anything specific, nothing I could point to, just that instinctive gut twist that tells you a person isn't quite right, a kind of wrongness you can't logically justify but also can't ignore. But logic didn't matter. My options were to get in or freeze to death, so I climbed inside. He started talking right away, not the quiet, cautious type of man you expect to meet on a mountain road at night. If anything, he was too talkative, too cheerful, the kind of person who forces friendliness into every sentence, filling the air with an energy that feels manufactured, like he was trying to preemptively convince me everything was fine before I'd even had time to think otherwise. I answered him politely, keeping my tone neutral, but something about the conversation unsettled me. His questions weren't strange on the surface, where I was coming from, where I was headed, who I was spending the holidays with, but the way he circled around them felt intentional, like he wanted to confirm whether or not someone was expecting me soon, whether or not someone would come looking if I didn't show up. The question that tipped me from uneasy to alarmed was when he asked if the people waiting for me knew exactly where I was. Not just that I was nearby, but whether they knew I was here right now, on this road, in this storm, in this truck with him. My pulse kicked up hard. He must have seen something change in my eyes because his expression shifted just slightly. I told him they did, that I'd been sharing my location the whole drive, that my dad and brother were already on the road toward me.
None of it was true. Nobody knew anything. He didn't like my answer. He kept his expression neutral, but I felt the temperature in the cab drop. Not physically, but in that subtle, unmistakable way someone reacts when a plan they were forming suddenly hits a snag. I told myself I might be overreacting, that the storm and darkness were making me paranoid. But that lie collapsed the minute he made a turn I knew was wrong. He should have gone left. The nearest town was left. I knew those roads intimately. I'd grown up here. To the right, there were only scattered cabins, hunting land, and long stretches of nothing. I'd once gotten lost on that same road as a teenager and never forgotten it. I asked him why we turned, and he gave a smooth explanation about an alternate route, a safer one during storms. The kind of answer that would have convinced me if I didn't know better. I pretended to buy it, even thanked him. I watched his shoulders loosen just barely. My lie was working. But now I had no plan, and I needed one fast. Jumping out of the moving truck wasn't an option. Running into the woods would kill me faster than he could. The only remotely possible strategy was to catch him off guard and use something, anything in that truck against him. I figured a man like him driving through the mountains at night probably had tools, maybe snow gear, maybe even weapons. The back of that truck was my only hope. I just needed an excuse to make him stop. The first thing that came to mind was claiming I needed to urinate desperately. He hesitated, suggested I wait, said we were close. I told him I couldn't, that I had a medical issue. Eventually, he pulled over. The moment the truck slowed, I bolted toward the back. I prayed the storage compartment was unlocked. It was. In the second it took me to lift the door, I heard him shout and start coming after me, but I had been faster. My hand closed around the first thing large enough to defend myself, a shotgun. He reached me just as I turned. I brought the butt of the gun up and slammed it into the side of his head, harder than I meant to. My heart was hammering. For a moment, I just stood there staring at him sprawled unconscious in the snow, trying to piece together what the hell I was supposed to do. The contents of the truck didn't make me feel better. Fuel cans, rope, duct tape, random junk shoved into bags with no clear purpose. Practical items for the mountains, sure, but also the kind of things you'd expect to see in a true crime documentary about a killer's kit. A sliver of doubt tried to wedge itself into my mind. Maybe he really had just been a weird but harmless local. But no, him turning down that road told me everything I needed to know. I found rope and tied him to the back seat of his own truck. I wasn't an expert, but I'd been a Boy Scout long enough to know how to make a knot that wouldn't loosen up. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to focus, to get into the driver's seat, to start the truck, and to point it back toward home. The drive felt endless. Every bump made me think he might wake up. Every shadow made me think he'd get free. Every silence made me fear I'd made a massive mistake and was about to be the one arrested. I called my brother when I got close enough to pick up a signal, voice shaking as I told him I needed help. He didn't hesitate. He was already outside when I pulled into my parents' driveway. He took one look at the man tied in the back and recognized him instantly. He said the guy was a carpenter from the area, and a tourist had accused him of attempted kidnapping a couple years back. Nothing had come of it officially, but the story had spread enough that most locals kept their distance from him. Some believed the tourist, some didn't, but everyone agreed the man gave off a bad feeling. My brother said we'd drive him somewhere secluded and leave him with a warning, one written clearly enough that he wouldn't misunderstand. A threat I hated to make, but at that point, I understood too well how close I'd come to disappearing in those mountains. For days afterwards, I expected a knock on the door, or the police showing up, or the man himself coming back for revenge. None of that happened. 15 years have passed now. I still won't drive mountain roads in bad weather, and I never heard another thing about him. But every year around Christmas when I'm driving home again, I think about that night, those dark roads, that storm, that man, and I remind myself how easily everything could have ended differently.
My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I'm a mining engineer from Denver, Colorado. What I uncovered beneath the Appalachian Mountains 3 years ago still makes me question everything I thought I knew about government oversight and human decency. I was hired by Black Ridge Resources to conduct feasibility studies on defunct mining operations throughout eastern Kentucky. The company was looking to revitalize coal extraction in regions that had been economically devastated since the mines closed in the 1980s. My specialty was assessing tunnel stability and evaluating whether old infrastructure could support modern equipment. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. I'd spend 6 weeks surveying 23 abandoned sites, compiling reports on structural integrity, water infiltration, and potential hazards. I'd done similar work in Wyoming and Montana without incident. Site 17 was different from the start. The mine entrance sat at the end of a fire road that hadn't appeared on any of my maps. I only found it because a local surveyor mentioned it in passing, describing it as the old Hendricks operation up past Crooked Creek. When I asked why it wasn't in the company's database, he just shrugged and said some places got left off the books during the transition to digital records. The entrance had been recently maintained. The steel security gate showed fresh welding, and the lock was new enough that it still had the manufacturer's sticker. Someone had been accessing this mine regularly, which contradicted everything in the historical records. I documented the discrepancy in my field notes and proceeded with the survey. The lock yielded easily to my universal key, and I stepped inside with my equipment bag and backup power supply. The first anomaly was the lighting. Modern LED fixtures ran along the ceiling at regular intervals, professionally installed with proper conduit and junction boxes. This was recent work, probably within the last 5 years, yet no permits had been filed for electrical installation. I followed the main tunnel approximately 300 yards before encountering the first sealed door. It was industrial-grade steel with a keypad entry system and a card reader. This was not mining equipment. This was the kind of security you'd find at a research facility or military installation. My engineering curiosity overrode my common sense. I used my thermal camera to examine the doorframe and discovered the lock mechanism generated a small heat signature, indicating it was powered and active. I also noticed ventilation ducting that ran through a gap above the door, suggesting active climate control in the spaces beyond. I documented everything with photographs and measurements, planning to include this unusual finding in my report. Then I noticed something that changed everything. A maintenance schedule posted on a clipboard hanging beside the door. It listed daily inspections, weekly systems checks, and monthly deep cleaning protocols. The most recent entry was dated 2 days ago. Someone was operating an active facility inside the supposedly abandoned mine, and they were maintaining it with the precision of a government installation. I should have left immediately and reported what I'd found. Instead, I spent the next hour searching for an alternate entrance. Mining operations always had emergency exits and ventilation shafts, and I was betting this facility followed the same principle. I found what I was looking for in a branch tunnel that had been marked as collapsed on the original mine schematics. The collapse was fabricated, a false wall of stacked timbers and debris that concealed a functional passage. Beyond it, I discovered a stairwell descending deeper into the mountain, cut through solid rock with machine precision that far exceeded 1980s mining technology. The stairwell led to a second level that never appeared on any official mine documentation. This wasn't an expansion of the original coal operation. This was purpose-built construction, probably completed after the mine's official closure. I found myself in a corridor with sealed rooms on both sides, each marked with alphanumeric codes rather than descriptive labels. Through a narrow window in one door, I saw what appeared to be a medical examination room, complete with a surgical table and monitoring equipment. The next room contained filing cabinets. The door was unlocked. Inside, I found decades of records documenting something called Project Appalachian Echo. The files dated back to 1947 and detailed a program focused on behavioral modification through environmental isolation and pharmaceutical intervention. Early documents referenced Department of Defense funding and clearance levels I'd never heard of. The subject files were what broke me.
Hundreds of individuals, identified by number rather than name, who had been brought to this facility over the past 75 years. The intake notes described them as low-priority missing persons with minimal social connections, which was bureaucratic language for people no one would look for. Each file documented months or years of procedures, experimental drugs, sensory deprivation, surgical interventions, and psychological conditioning. The medical photography was clinical and horrifying, showing the progression of whatever was being done to these people. Recent files indicated the facility was still operational. The last intake had occurred 2 weeks before my arrival. I was photographing documents when I heard voices in the corridor. I killed my headlamp and pressed myself into the space behind the filing cabinets, barely breathing, as 2 people entered the room. They were discussing a subject who was approaching the transition phase and debating whether to proceed with the next protocol or extend the conditioning period. They talked about human beings with detached professionalism of scientists discussing lab specimens. One of them walked to the exact filing cabinet I'd been searching. I heard folders being pulled and papers shuffling inches from where I was hiding. Then his radio crackled with a message I couldn't quite make out, and they both left, still discussing their work. I waited 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours before moving. I gathered as much photographic evidence as I could carry and made my way back toward the stairwell.
That's when I heard the screaming. It came from deeper in the facility, multiple voices expressing terror and pain in a way that bypassed rational thought and went straight to primal fear. I stood frozen, knowing I should run but unable to ignore what I was hearing. I found them in a wing I hadn't yet explored, a dozen cells with reinforced doors and observation windows. Inside were people in various states of physical and psychological deterioration. Some were catatonic. Others were actively suffering from whatever had been done to them. One woman pressed against the window of her cell when she saw me. Her eyes were wild with desperation, and she mouthed a single word: "Please." I tried 3 different doors before finding one with a manual override. I got it open and helped a man who couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds stumble into the corridor. He kept repeating a string of numbers, which I later realized was the subject identification he'd been conditioned to respond to. That's when the alarm started. I won't detail everything that happened next. What matters is that I managed to get that man out of the facility and into my truck. I drove straight to the FBI field office in Lexington and turned over everything I documented. The raid occurred 2 days later. They found 17 people being held in that facility, along with evidence of hundreds more who had passed through over the decades. 12 individuals were arrested, including 2 former government employees and a private contractor with connections to intelligence agencies. The media coverage was minimal. The official story described it as an unlicensed medical research facility that had been conducting unauthorized clinical trials. No mention of the 75-year history or the government's original involvement. I was paid handsomely for my silence. My contract with Black Ridge Resources was terminated with a generous settlement and a non-disclosure agreement that prevents me from discussing specific details of what I found. But I can tell you this: Project Appalachian Echo was not an isolated incident. There are other facilities, other programs still operating in the deep places beneath those ancient mountains, and they're still taking people who won't be missed.
I'm Catherine Reeves, a folklorist from Charleston, South Carolina. My academic career has been dedicated to documenting the musical traditions of the American South, particularly the ballads and folk songs that have been passed down through generations in isolated Appalachian communities. 2 years ago, I inherited property in Southwest Virginia from a distant cousin I'd met only once at a family reunion. The inheritance included a small farmhouse and 40 acres in a hollow called Singing Creek, named for the musical quality of the water flowing over the rocky stream bed. My cousin's attorney explained that the property had been in our family since the 1790s, but had been vacant for nearly 30 years. My cousin, who had lived in Richmond for most of her adult life, had maintained the property taxes, but had never visited or explained why she'd kept paying for land she never used. The attorney handed me a sealed envelope along with the property deed. Inside was a handwritten letter from my cousin, dated just weeks before her death from cancer. "Catherine," it read, "I'm leaving you this property because you're the only person in the family who might understand what I'm about to tell you. There is something in Singing Creek Hollow that our family has been protecting, or perhaps hiding from, for generations. I was supposed to explain this responsibility to you in person, but my illness has progressed too quickly. Whatever you do, do not stay at the farmhouse during the weeks when the serviceberry trees bloom. If you hear music coming from the forest during those weeks, do not investigate it, do not record it, and above all, do not follow it. Some melodies are not meant for human ears." As a folklorist, I was naturally intrigued rather than frightened. Mountain families are full of superstitions and local legends, and I assumed this was my cousin's way of adding mystique to the property. The serviceberry bloom warning was particularly interesting, as those trees have significant symbolism in Appalachian folklore. I decided to spend a month at the farmhouse during the summer, using it as a base while I interviewed elderly residents in the surrounding counties about traditional music and stories. The property was beautiful in a stark way, the old farmhouse perched on a hillside, with the hollow stretching out below and mountains rising on all sides. I arrived in late May, deliberately during the serviceberry bloom, determined to document whatever my cousin had been so concerned about. If there was a local legend or musical tradition associated with the property, it could be valuable material for my research. The first week was uneventful. I spent my days interviewing local musicians and my evenings transcribing recordings and organizing my notes. The farmhouse had no electricity, so I worked by lantern light and went to bed early, lulled to sleep by the sound of Singing Creek in the valley below. On the 8th night, I heard the music. It began just after midnight as a distant melody played on what sounded like a violin or fiddle. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, built on modal scales that were common in old Appalachian ballads, but arranged in ways I'd never heard before. As a trained musicologist, I could identify elements from dozens of traditional songs woven together into something entirely new. I grabbed my recording equipment and stepped onto the porch, trying to determine the direction of the sound. The melody seemed to come from the hollow below the farmhouse, somewhere near the creek. I should have remembered my cousin's warning. Instead, I saw an opportunity to document something unique. I followed the music down the hillside, using my flashlight to navigate the overgrown path that led toward the creek. The melody grew clearer as I descended, revealing complex harmonies and rhythmic variations that suggested a master musician with decades of training. When I reached the creek bottom, the music stopped. I stood in the darkness, listening to the water flowing over rocks and the normal sounds of the forest at night. After several minutes of silence, I started back up the hill, disappointed but planning to try again the following night. That's when I saw the figure standing on the path ahead of me. He was tall and thin, dressed in clothing that looked like it belonged to another century, a long dark coat, high-collared shirt, and trousers that buttoned at the knee. He carried a violin tucked under one arm, the instrument gleaming with an unusual luster in my flashlight beam. "You're Catherine," he said, his voice soft but carrying clearly through the night air. "Sarah told me you might come." I asked who he was and how he knew my cousin. He smiled, but it was an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I've known your family for longer than you can imagine. I knew your great-great-great-grandmother when she first came to this hollow as a bride. I knew her grandfather before that, and I'll know your grandchildren's grandchildren if they're foolish enough to return." He raised the violin to his shoulder and began to play. The melody was transcendent, more beautiful than anything I'd ever heard in 30 years of studying folk music. It incorporated elements from ballads I recognized, Barbara Allen, Pretty Sarah, The Unquiet Grave, but transformed them into something that felt both ancient and impossibly sophisticated. I stood transfixed, all thoughts of recording or documentation forgotten. The music seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my chest and skull, triggering emotions I couldn't name and memories I didn't recognize. He played for what might have been minutes or hours. I lost all sense of time passing. The melody told stories of the mountains before European settlement, of the people who had lived and died in these hollows for thousands of years, of bargains made and prices paid by families like mine who claimed this land as their own. When he finally lowered the violin, I realized I was crying, though I couldn't have said why. "Your cousin understood the agreement. She paid the price for her grandfather's mistake, spent her whole life making sure I was undisturbed during the blooming weeks. Now that duty falls to you." I asked what would happen if I refused. He smiled again, and this time I saw that his teeth were too white, too perfect, and too numerous. "Then I'll play for you every night during the bloom season, and each night you'll follow the music a little deeper into the hollow. Eventually, you'll follow it all the way to where I live, down in the places beneath the mountain that humans were never meant to see, and you'll join the others who couldn't resist the melody." He gestured toward the forest behind him, and I saw them, pale figures standing between the trees, dozens of people watching with empty eyes. They swayed slightly, as if still hearing music I could no longer perceive. "Your great-great-great-grandmother's youngest son is here," he said, conversationally. "He followed my music in 1847 and never found his way back. And Sarah's uncle, who ignored the warnings in 1963. And 7 others from your family line, going back to the first settlers who cleared this land and built their cabin on ground that was already claimed." I ran. I don't remember the climb back to the farmhouse, but I remember barricading the door and sitting with my back against it until sunrise, listening to the violin music that continued outside until the first birds began to sing. I left that morning and never returned. I sold the property to a developer who planned to turn it into vacation rentals, and I included no warnings or explanations in the sale documents. Sometimes I wonder if the new owners hear the music during serviceberry bloom. Sometimes I wonder if they're smart enough to ignore it. But mostly, I wonder about those figures I saw in the forest, still swaying to melodies only they can hear, trapped forever in Singing Creek Hollow by a musician who's been playing the same songs for centuries.
My name is David Santos, and I'm a survival consultant from Portland, Oregon. For the past 12 years, I've made my living testing outdoor equipment for manufacturers and teaching wilderness survival courses to military personnel and civilian enthusiasts. I've worked in every major wilderness area in North America, from the Arctic tundra to the Sonoran Desert. Nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened in the Cherokee National Forest last October. I was conducting a 3-week solo evaluation of advanced navigation technology for a defense contractor developing equipment for special operations forces. The gear package included military-grade GPS systems, encrypted satellite communications, advanced biometric sensors, and experimental augmented reality displays that overlaid tactical information on the natural environment. My assignment was to stress test this technology in genuine wilderness conditions, documenting performance metrics and identifying potential failure points. I'd chosen an extremely remote section of the Cherokee National Forest,
an area without trails or established campsites, where I'd be completely dependent on the equipment for navigation and emergency communication. The first 5 days went flawlessly. The GPS provided pinpoint accuracy, the satellite link maintained strong connectivity, and the augmented reality system successfully identified terrain features and optimal routes. I was honestly impressed by the technological sophistication of the equipment. On the 6th night, everything changed. I woke around 2 a.m. to find every electronic device completely non-functional. The GPS units showed corrupted displays with impossible coordinates. The satellite phone couldn't acquire a signal despite clear skies. Even my basic LED flashlight flickered and died, despite having fresh batteries installed that afternoon. My first thought was electromagnetic interference from a solar event or atmospheric phenomenon. I retrieved my backup equipment from its Faraday cage, a shielded container that should protect electronics from electromagnetic pulses, but those devices were equally compromised. More disturbing was the failure of my mechanical instruments. My compass spun aimlessly, never settling on a consistent direction. My mechanical altimeter showed readings that varied by thousands of feet within seconds. My wind-up watch had stopped at exactly 2:17 a.m. I'd experienced equipment failures before, but never a simultaneous cascade across both electronic and mechanical systems. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. This was deliberate. As dawn broke, I noticed changes in my surroundings. The campsite was exactly where I'd established it, but the terrain beyond looked subtly different. A distinctive rock formation I'd used as a landmark had shifted position. The ridgeline on the horizon had altered its profile. The stream I'd been using for water was flowing in a different direction. I consulted my topographic maps and compared them to what I could see. Nothing matched. It was as if I'd been transported to a similar but distinctly different location while I slept. I spent the morning attempting to re-establish my position using traditional navigation methods, observing the sun's movement, identifying distant landmarks, following water drainage patterns. Every technique produced contradictory results. According to my calculations, I should be in 3 different locations simultaneously, separated by miles of mountainous terrain. That's when I realized I was being watched. The sensation was unmistakable after years of training in tactical awareness. Someone or something was observing me from multiple positions, maintaining careful distance while tracking my movements. I caught brief glimpses of motion in my peripheral vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly. By afternoon, I decided to abandon the equipment test and hike out to the nearest road, approximately 15 miles southeast of my original position. I packed my essential gear and began moving using the sun's position as a rough directional guide. After 6 hours of steady hiking, I should have covered significant distance. Instead, I found myself approaching a campsite that looked disturbingly familiar. I'd walked in a wide circle and returned to my starting point, despite maintaining what I'd believed was a consistent bearing. I tried again, this time marking my trail with reflective tape at regular intervals. After 4 hours, I encountered my own markers, confirming I was traveling in circles despite my efforts to navigate in a straight line. As darkness fell, I made camp and prepared for a second night without functional equipment. I was rationing my food supplies, knowing that without navigation tools, I might be stranded for much longer than planned. That's when my experimental augmented reality display activated on its own. The head-mounted unit I'd been testing flickered to life, despite having been completely non-functional since the previous night. The display showed my normal view of the forest, with additional overlays that hadn't been part of the original programming. I could see structures in the forest, geometric patterns and architectural forms that occupied the same space as trees and terrain, but existed in some separate layer of reality. The structures were sophisticated and clearly artificial, constructed with design principles that didn't match any human engineering I recognized. More unsettling were the entities the display revealed. Dozens of humanoid figures moved through the forest around my position. They were roughly human in shape,
but wrong in subtle ways. Too tall, with proportions that didn't match biological norms, and moving with a fluid grace that suggested different gravity or physical laws. When I removed the display and looked at the forest with my naked eyes, I saw nothing but normal wilderness. But when I put the display back on, the structures and entities remained visible. One of the figures approached my campsite. Through the augmented reality display, I could see it clearly. Approximately 7 feet tall, with limbs that bent in too many places, and a head that was smooth and featureless, except for subtle patterns that might be sensory organs. Then it spoke, not with sound, but directly into my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. Your species' technology is primitive, but developing in interesting directions. We've been observing your progress for some time. I demanded to know what was happening and who or what they were. We exist in frequencies of matter and energy your science hasn't yet discovered. Your augmented reality device, designed to overlaying digital information on physical reality, accidentally created a bridge that allows you to perceive our existence. This was not intentional on your part, which makes it interesting. The entity explained that they had been present in these mountains far longer than human civilization. They exist alongside human reality, occasionally intersecting with it in ways that humans perceive as paranormal phenomena or equipment malfunctions. My navigation equipment hadn't failed randomly. They had modified it to demonstrate their technological capabilities and to test my responses to phenomena that contradicted my understanding of physics and reality. We sometimes conduct studies, observing how individual humans react when their technological frameworks prove inadequate. You've performed adequately. Your survival instincts remain functional despite cognitive dissonance. I asked if I was free to leave. You were always free to leave. The difficulty you've experienced with navigation was educational rather than restrictive. We wanted you to understand that your species' mastery of technology is less comprehensive than you believe. The entity gestured toward the forest, and suddenly my GPS unit activated, showing my correct position and a clear route to the nearest road. My compass settled on magnetic north. My satellite phone acquired a strong signal. Your equipment will function normally now, but we've made minor modifications to some devices. Occasionally, they will show you glimpses of what exists beyond your normal perception. Consider it a reminder that reality is more complex than your instruments can measure. I hiked out the following day without incident. My equipment functioned perfectly, and I reached my extraction point on schedule. According to the timestamps on my satellite communications, I had maintained regular contact with my support team throughout the entire experience. From their perspective, nothing unusual had occurred. But my augmented reality display still shows me things that shouldn't exist, structures and entities that occupy the spaces between human perception, carrying on their business in frequencies we can't normally detect. I completed my equipment evaluation and submitted my report, omitting certain details that wouldn't have been believed. The technology works exactly as designed. It's reality itself that's more complicated than we thought. Sometimes I wonder how many other pieces of advanced technology are accidentally bridging the gap between what we can perceive and what actually exists all around us, invisible until our instruments become sophisticated enough to detect it. The Appalachian Mountains are old, far older than human civilization, and they contain inhabitants who were there long before we arrived and likely will remain long after we're gone.
My name is James Mitchell, and I'm a wildlife photographer from Seattle, Washington. What happened to me in the Blue Ridge Mountains 4 years ago taught me that the most dangerous predators in the wilderness aren't the ones with claws and teeth. I was 32 at the time, recently divorced and looking for a way to rebuild my portfolio after taking a few years off from professional photography. I'd spent most of my career shooting in the Pacific Northwest, Cascades, Olympics, the rugged Oregon coast, but I wanted something different. The Appalachian Mountains seemed perfect, ancient, atmospheric, and relatively unexplored in terms of modern nature photography. I planned a 10-day trek through Virginia and West Virginia, focusing on capturing the transition between spring and summer in the deciduous forests. I'd researched the trails extensively, marked camping spots, and packed all the necessary gear for solo backcountry work. The first 3 days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I got stunning shots of morning mist in the valleys, wildflowers blooming on exposed ridges, and the kind of moody forest scenes that magazine editors love. I was making excellent time, averaging about 15 miles per day on well-maintained trails. On the fourth morning, I woke to discover that both my phone and GPS watch were completely drained despite being fully charged the night before. My backup battery pack was also dead, which seemed impossible. It was a high-quality unit I'd used reliably for years. I wasn't overly concerned. I had paper maps, a compass, and plenty of experience with traditional navigation. The trail I was following was clearly marked with painted blazes on trees, and I had several days of food and water. Around mid-morning, I stopped at a scenic overlook to photograph the valley below. That's when I met him. He appeared from a side trail I hadn't noticed, moving quietly through the underbrush. He was probably in his 50s, with weathered skin and the kind of lean build that comes from a lifetime of physical work. He wore hunting camouflage and carried a walking stick that looked hand-carved from mountain laurel. "Head inside?" he asked, nodding toward my pack. I confirmed I was, explaining my route and my rough timeline. He introduced himself as Dale Pritchard and said he'd been hiking these mountains since he was a boy. He had that easy, confident manner of someone completely at home in the wilderness. "You picked a good route," he said, "but there's a section about 8 miles ahead where the main trail's been washed out pretty bad. Recent storms took out a whole hillside. They haven't updated the maps yet because it just happened 2 weeks ago." He pulled out his own map and showed me the problem area, then traced an alternate route that would add some distance but keep me on solid ground. His knowledge was impressive. He pointed out specific landmarks, warned me about a spring that had gone dry, and even mentioned a black bear saw with cubs that had been spotted in the area. "If you want," he offered, "I'm heading in roughly the same direction. I know a route that'll save you about 6 miles and take you through some of the prettiest country in this part of the mountains. Most hikers never see it because it's off the main trail system." Every rational part of my brain said no. This was a stranger offering to lead me away from marked trails into remote wilderness. But his local knowledge seemed genuine, and the idea of seeing pristine areas that most photographers never accessed was incredibly appealing. I agreed, telling myself I'd turn back if anything felt wrong. The first few hours were actually wonderful. Dale led me through sections of old-growth forest that were absolutely spectacular for photography. He knew the terrain intimately, pointing out wildlife signs, explaining local ecology, and sharing stories about the region's history. He told me about the families who had lived in these hollows before the National Forest System displaced them, about forgotten settlements that were now just foundations and fruit trees gone wild. He showed me an abandoned moonshine still from the Prohibition era, hidden in a rocky cleft where it probably sat undisturbed since the 1930s. But gradually, I began to notice inconsistencies. We'd been hiking for over 3 hours, but none of the landmarks Dale had mentioned on his map had appeared. When I asked about it, he said the terrain looked different in different seasons, and I might not recognize features from their map descriptions. Then I realized we weren't following any kind of trail anymore. Dale was just leading me through the forest, choosing routes that wound between trees and over ridges with no apparent logic. When I stopped to check my compass and get a bearing, Dale laughed and said compasses were unreliable in these mountains because of iron deposits in the rocks. That's when I noticed we were being followed. I caught glimpses of movement paralleling our route, staying about 50 yards off to our right. Then I spotted another figure ahead of us, moving through the trees just at the edge of visibility. I confronted Dale about it, and his entire demeanor shifted. The friendly guide persona disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Friends of mine," he said simply. "These mountains can be dangerous. They're making sure we don't run into any trouble." When I said I wanted to head back to the main trail, Dale tilted his head and asked if I even knew which direction that was. He was right. I'd been so focused on following him that I'd lost track of our direction relative to my original route. "Here's the thing," Dale said, his voice still conversational but with an edge underneath. "You're going to keep walking with me. We've got a place set up about 2 miles from here where you can rest, get some food, maybe trade some of that expensive camera equipment for safe passage back to civilization."
The two figures I'd spotted earlier had moved closer, and I could now see a third person behind us. I was surrounded by people who clearly had practice at this, working together to control someone's movements through the wilderness. I made a split-second decision. I dropped my camera bag, my most valuable equipment, and ran perpendicular to our route, hoping to break through their perimeter before they could react. The forest erupted with shouts and the sound of multiple people crashing through the undergrowth. Dale was yelling something about me being stupid, that I'd die out here without help, that they were just trying to be friendly. I ran without any sense of direction, just trying to put distance between myself and the voices. Branches tore at my face and arms. I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely keeping my feet under me. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept moving. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes, I had to stop. I collapsed behind a fallen tree, gasping for air and trying to listen past my own heartbeat. That's when I heard the whistling. It wasn't a tune, more like a bird call, sharp and piercing, coming from at least 3 different directions. They were communicating, coordinating their search pattern. These men knew exactly how to hunt someone through dense forest. I forced myself to keep moving, trying to go uphill, because I remembered that the main trail system followed the ridge lines. If I could get high enough, I might be able to see some landmark that would orient me. The whistling followed me, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but never completely disappearing. They were tracking me, probably reading the signs I was leaving as I crashed through the underbrush. Just before sunset, I broke through the tree line onto an exposed ridge and saw the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, a white painted blaze on a tree about 100 yards away. I'd found the Appalachian Trail. I ran for that marker like it was salvation itself. Once I reached the marked trail, I turned north, away from the direction Dale had been leading me, and started moving as fast as I could while still following the blazes. I hiked through the entire night, using my flashlight sparingly to conserve batteries, stopping only when I absolutely had to rest. Around dawn, I reached a road crossing, where I flagged down a pickup truck driven by an older woman heading to work. She took one look at my torn clothes and bleeding face and immediately drove me to the local sheriff's office, where I reported everything that had happened. The deputy who took my statement wasn't surprised. He told me they'd had multiple reports over the past 5 years of hikers being approached by helpful locals, who then led them off-trail into remote areas. Some hikers had managed to escape, like I had. Others had been robbed and left to find their own way back, and a few had never been seen again. The deputy explained that these remote mountain areas are perfect for this kind of crime. Victims are isolated, often have valuable gear, and the vast wilderness makes it nearly impossible to track the perpetrators. Even when they identify suspects, getting enough evidence for prosecution is extremely difficult. I lost my camera bag with over $8,000 worth of equipment, but I consider myself lucky. The deputy showed me missing persons reports for 3 solo hikers who had disappeared in that same area over the past 2 years, all last seen after meeting friendly locals who offered to show them off-trail routes. I've never gone back to the Appalachian Mountains. These days, I stick to well-traveled areas with plenty of other people around, and I never, ever accept help from strangers who appear out of nowhere in the wilderness, no matter how genuine they seem. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm a high school history teacher from Boston, Massachusetts. The property I inherited from my great-uncle last year came with a responsibility I never asked for, and a truth I wish I'd never learned. I barely knew my great-uncle Thomas.
He was my grandmother's older brother, and he lived his entire life in the mountains of West Virginia, rarely leaving and never coming to family gatherings in the city. My grandmother always spoke of him with a mixture of affection and concern, saying Thomas had chosen a hard life in the mountains because of obligations the rest of the family didn't understand. When Thomas died at age 89, I was shocked to learn he'd left me everything: a remote cabin on 70 acres of mountain property, along with a small savings account and a locked metal box that his lawyer said could only be opened after I'd visited the property. The lawyer strongly suggested I sell the land without visiting it. He said Thomas had been very clear that the property required specific maintenance that most people wouldn't want to deal with, and that it would be better for everyone if I simply liquidated the asset and moved on. But I was curious. I'd just finished a difficult school year, and the idea of spending a few weeks in a remote mountain cabin sounded like exactly the kind of solitude I needed. I took the keys, the directions, and the locked metal box, and drove from Boston to West Virginia. The cabin was much more isolated than I'd expected. The drive from the nearest town took over an hour, the last 30 minutes on increasingly rough dirt roads that wound through dense forest. The property sat in a narrow valley between steep ridges, with a clear stream running through the bottom, and the cabin perched on a small plateau about halfway up the southern slope. The cabin itself was old but well-maintained. Thomas had clearly kept up with repairs over the years. There was a generator for electricity, a propane system for heating and cooking, and a good well for water. The interior was furnished simply but comfortably, with shelves full of books and a stone fireplace that dominated the main room. I spent the first day settling in and exploring the immediate area around the cabin. The valley was beautiful in a stark way, and I can understand why someone might choose this isolation over city life. That evening, I finally opened the locked metal box. Inside was a leather-bound journal, a detailed hand-drawn map of the property, and a letter addressed to me in my great-uncle's handwriting. "Sarah," the letter began, "I'm sorry to burden you with this, but you're the only family member left who might be capable of understanding and continuing what needs to be done. Our family has been the caretakers of this land for nearly 200 years, not by choice, but by necessity. What I'm about to tell you will sound like superstition or madness, but I promise you it's neither. It's simply a truth that most people are lucky enough never to encounter." The letter explained that something lived in the mountains around the cabin, something that had been there long before European settlers arrived. Thomas called it the Old Presence, and described it as a force or entity that existed in the deep places beneath the mountains, sustained by specific rituals that his family had been performing since the 1820s. According to the letter, Thomas's great-grandfather had made some kind of agreement with the Old Presence after accidentally discovering one of its feeding places during a hunting trip. The exact details of that original encounter were lost to time, but the result was clear. The family would maintain regular offerings at specific locations, and in return, the Old Presence would protect the family's land and ensure their prosperity. But the agreement came with strict rules. The offerings had to be made monthly during the warm seasons. They had to consist of fresh meat from animals hunted on the property, and they had to be left at a specific location that Thomas called the giving place. Failure to maintain the offerings would release the family from protection and make them subject to the Old Presence's hunger. The journal contained decades of entries documenting Thomas's maintenance of this ritual. He'd kept meticulous records of each offering, the date, the type and quantity of meat, the weather conditions, and any unusual observations. The entries were matter-of-fact, describing the ritual in the same tone someone might use to document routine farm work. But scattered throughout the journal were entries that were very different. These described encounters with the Old Presence itself, moments when Thomas had seen or felt its attention focused on him. He described a sound like stone grinding against stone that came from deep underground, a smell like minerals and decay that preceded its appearances, and a sensation of pressure that made breathing difficult and thoughts unclear. One entry from 15 years ago particularly disturbed me. Failed to make the May offering due to illness. By the third day, I could feel it stirring in the deep places, growing restless and hungry. On the fourth night, I heard it moving through the valley, and in the morning, I found the walker's old cabin had collapsed inward, as if something had pulled it down from underneath. Made an emergency offering of everything I had, 3 deer, 2 turkeys, and a black bear I'd been saving. It accepted them, and the stirring stopped. But I could feel its displeasure. Must never let this happen again. The map showed the location of the giving place, approximately 1.5 miles from the cabin, up a steep tributary valley that branched off from the main creek. Thomas had marked the route carefully, with notes about specific landmarks and warnings about areas to avoid. I should have left immediately. I should have locked the cabin, driven back to Boston, and put the property on the market without ever looking back. But part of me, the part that had chosen to become a history teacher because I wanted to understand how people really lived, needed to see this through. I needed to know if what my great-uncle described was real or just the delusions of an isolated man who'd spent too many years alone in the mountains. The next morning, I followed the map to the giving place. The hike took about 2 hours, following the creek up the tributary valley until I reached a section where the stream seemed to disappear into the mountainside. The water didn't flow over rocks like a normal stream. It literally sank into the ground, pouring into a crack in the bedrock that angled down into darkness. The giving place was a natural amphitheater of stones surrounding the point where the water disappeared. The rock walls were smooth and dark, and the air had a mineral smell that reminded me of deep caves. The entire area felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate, not threatening exactly, but profoundly other, like I was standing in a space that operated by different rules than the normal world. Around the edges of the amphitheater, I found evidence of my great-uncle's offerings. Bones, lots of them, scattered across the stone and partially dissolved by something that definitely wasn't normal decay. Some of the bones looked fresh, probably from offerings made in the months before Thomas died. Others were much older, cracked and stained by years of exposure. I also found bones that were clearly not from deer or bear. Human bones. Skulls and long bones that had been there for a very long time, slowly being absorbed by whatever process was at work in this place. I took photographs and measurements, trying to approach this like a research project rather than a nightmare. But as I worked, I became increasingly aware of a sound coming from deep underground, a low, rhythmic grinding, like enormous stones being rubbed together far beneath my feet. The sound grew louder as I stood there, and I began to feel what Thomas had described in his journal, a pressure that made breathing difficult and thoughts unclear. Something was aware of my presence, something vast and ancient that existed in the spaces beneath the mountain. I left the giving place quickly and hiked back to the cabin, my mind racing. Everything Thomas had written was true. There was something in these mountains, something that had been sustained by my family's offerings for nearly 200 years, and now that responsibility had fallen to me. That night, I heard it moving through the valley. The grinding sound echoed between the ridges, and I could feel vibrations through the floor of the cabin, as if something enormous was shifting position in the earth below. In the morning, I found that the stream running through the valley had changed course slightly, and a section of the hillside across from the cabin had collapsed inward, creating a depression about 20 feet across. I understood the message. The old presence was hungry. Thomas had been gone for almost 2 months, and no offerings had been made during that time. It was growing restless, and it was making sure I understood what would happen if I failed to continue the ritual. I've been making the offerings for a year now. Once a month during the warm seasons, I drive from Boston to West Virginia, hunt on the property, and carry fresh meat to the giving place. I follow every instruction Thomas left, maintaining the agreement that my family made nearly 2 centuries ago. I've never seen the old presence directly, and I hope I never do, but I've felt it, sensed its attention when I'm at the giving place, and I've learned to recognize the signs when it's satisfied versus when it's beginning to grow hungry. I still teach history in Boston. My friends and colleagues think I've just developed a passion for hunting and wilderness solitude. They don't know that I'm bound to a piece of mountain property by an obligation that I can never fully explain. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I simply stopped, if I sold the property and walked away, letting the old presence go hungry until it broke free of whatever constraints keep it contained in those deep places. But then I remember the collapsed hillside and the way the ground trembles when it's restless, and I make the drive to West Virginia once again. Some family obligations can never be escaped, no matter how far you run or how much you wish they'd never fallen to you.
My name is Alex Foster, and I'm an investigative journalist from Chicago, Illinois. What I discovered while researching a story in rural Kentucky 3 years ago ended my career and nearly ended my life. I was 26 at the time, working for a small investigative news outlet that specialized in uncovering corruption and criminal enterprises in rural America. We'd had some success with stories about illegal gambling operations and unlicensed medical practices in isolated communities, and I was always looking for the next big expose. I'd heard rumors about the traditional moonshine trade that supposedly still existed in the mountains of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia. Not the legal craft distilleries that had become tourist attractions, but genuine illegal operations run by families who'd been making corn liquor since before Prohibition. I thought it would make a great human interest story, the last of the traditional moonshiners carrying on an American folk tradition in defiance of modern regulations. I spent weeks cultivating sources in small mountain towns, talking to locals in diners and gas stations, trying to build trust and get introductions to people who might know where the real operations were happening. Most people either claimed ignorance or directed me to legal distilleries that sold sanitized versions of mountain culture to tourists. Finally, in a town called Hart's Creek, I met someone who seemed like a genuine connection. His name was Eddie, and he worked at a tire shop. After several conversations over the course of a week, he told me he knew someone who still made the real stuff, using methods that hadn't changed in 100 years. Eddie was careful. He made me prove I wasn't law enforcement, checked my credentials as a journalist, and made it very clear that if I wrote anything that brought attention to his friend's operation, there would be serious consequences. I assured him I would protect my sources and focus on the cultural and historical aspects of traditional distilling rather than the legal issues. He gave me directions to meet him at a hunting supply store the following Saturday morning. From there, he'd take me to meet his friend. The drive to the meeting point took me deep into the mountains on roads that got progressively narrower and more deteriorated. I met Eddie as planned, and he had me follow his truck on an unmarked dirt road that wound through the forest for at least half an hour. We finally stopped at a clearing where several other vehicles were already parked. The moonshine operation was more substantial than I'd expected. Multiple buildings, including what was clearly a functioning distillery housed in a large shed, plus several smaller structures for storage and processing. Eddie introduced me to Pete, who ran the operation. He was in his 70s, weathered and taciturn, but willing to talk about the history and craft of traditional moonshine production. He showed me the copper still his grandfather had built in the 1920s, explained the fermentation process, and let me taste several varieties of white lightning that ranged from harsh to surprisingly smooth. For the first few hours, it was exactly the story I'd hoped to find. Pete was knowledgeable and passionate about his craft, proud of maintaining traditions that most people had abandoned. I took notes and photographs, with permission, documenting an authentic piece of Appalachian culture. But as the afternoon wore on, more people began arriving.
They came in trucks and on ATVs, following the same rough road Eddie and I had used. Pete introduced them as customers and friends, but the atmosphere changed with each new arrival. These weren't just people picking up a few jars of moonshine. They were conducting business, exchanging cash for products that clearly weren't just corn liquor. I tried to stay focused on my moonshine story, but it was obvious I'd stumbled into something much larger. The operation wasn't just about preserving traditional distilling methods. It was a hub for multiple illegal activities, and these people were part of an organized network that used the remote location and moonshine operation as cover. That's when I made my critical mistake.
One of the newer arrivals was conducting a transaction with Pete that involved substantial amounts of cash and packages that definitely weren't moonshine. I was standing about 20 feet away, trying to appear disinterested while actually paying very close attention to what was being said and done. The man conducting the transaction noticed me watching. He stopped mid-conversation and asked Pete directly who I was and why there was a stranger at the compound during business hours. Eddie tried to vouch for me, explaining I was just a journalist writing about traditional moonshine culture, but the man wasn't satisfied. He walked over to me and asked to see my phone and camera. When I hesitated, he took them from me forcibly, going through my photos and notes. He found the photographs I'd taken of the distillery and the people at the compound. He found my notes about Pete's operation, and he found earlier notes from my weeks of research, including names of other people I'd talked to and questions I'd been asking about illegal activities in the region. "This is a problem," he said to Pete. "You brought a reporter here, a reporter who's been asking around about our business, a reporter who now has photographs and names." Several other men gathered around, and I realized I was in immediate danger. These weren't just moonshine enthusiasts protecting a folk tradition. These were criminals who'd built a sophisticated operation in a remote location specifically to avoid law enforcement attention, and I'd just documented their faces and activities. Pete looked genuinely distressed. He hadn't intended to expose a larger criminal enterprise, but his willingness to share his moonshine operation with a journalist had created a security breach that these other men took very seriously. They spent about 20 minutes debating what to do with me. Some argued for letting me go with a warning and a destroyed camera. Others insisted that I knew too much and couldn't be trusted to keep quiet. Eddie kept trying to defend me, saying I'd promised to protect sources and focus on the cultural aspects, but his credibility was also in question now. Finally, they came to a decision. They would keep me at the compound for a few days while they figured things out. My phone and camera would be destroyed. I would be kept under watch to ensure I didn't try to leave or contact anyone, and eventually they would decide whether I could be released with appropriate warnings or whether I represented too much risk to their operation. I was held in a small outbuilding with no windows, given basic food and water, but kept under constant surveillance. I could hear them outside discussing their options, debating whether a missing journalist would attract more attention than trying to scare me into silence. On the third day, Eddie helped me escape. He'd been arguing with the others about what to do with me, insisting that harming a journalist would bring far more law enforcement attention than anything I could write. Late that night, he unlocked the building where I was being held and told me to run. He gave me a 30-minute head start before he'd have to raise the alarm. Any longer and they'd know he'd helped me. He pointed me toward a direction that would eventually intersect with a logging road, told me to follow that road downhill until I reached a paved highway, then flagged down any vehicle I could find. I ran through the forest in complete darkness, falling constantly, getting turned around multiple times, but never stopping for more than a few seconds to catch my breath. Behind me, I eventually heard engines starting and voices calling out. They were coming after me. I reached the logging road just as the first ATV appeared behind me, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I kept running downhill, hearing more vehicles joining the pursuit. They were herding me, trying to cut me off before I reached the highway. I made it to the paved road just ahead of them and flagged down a semi-truck whose driver took one look at my torn clothes and terrified expression and immediately called 911 while driving me to the nearest police station. The state police investigation that followed was extensive. My testimony and the evidence I'd gathered during my first few hours at the compound helped them build a case against multiple individuals.
But the prosecution was complicated by jurisdictional issues, the remote location, and the fact that most of my photographic evidence had been destroyed. Several people were eventually arrested, but many others simply disappeared into the mountains before law enforcement could reach them. The moonshine operation was shut down, but everyone involved knew it would just re-establish itself somewhere else, deeper in the wilderness, where journalists and law enforcement would be even less likely to find it. I left investigative journalism after that. The outlet I worked for couldn't protect me from potential retaliation, and I couldn't shake the paranoia that people from that mountain compound might still be looking for me. I moved to a different city, changed careers, and stopped pursuing stories about rural crime. I learned that some stories aren't worth telling, no matter how interesting they might be. And I learned that the remote mountain regions of America still contain communities and operations that exist completely outside the reach of modern law and society, protected by geography, isolation, and the willingness to use violence against anyone who threatens to expose them.
I was born in a town that barely shows up on maps, tucked between the ridges of eastern Tennessee, the kind of place where the trees outnumber people and night arrives like a heavy curtain you can't pull back. I was 6 when the incident happened, but the memory is sharper than most of my adult years. My family lived on the edge of a small mountain community. The houses were spaced far enough apart that neighbors didn't share sugar, they shared warning signs. There was an old stone ruin near the valley's edge. Not a castle, not really, more like the skeleton of one. Crumbling walls, no roof, no recorded origin. The locals called it the Watchtower. No one knew who built it or why it was abandoned so violently by time. My father believed the mountains were a testing ground for faith. He didn't just distrust the woods, he treated them like a living adversary. He said the forest whispered temptations, that anything wandering beneath the branches at night was sent to pull people away from salvation. Because of him, we never crossed the tree line when walking to church. Instead, we followed a long gravel path that bent around the hills like a cautious river. My mother held a different belief. She saw the mountains as ancient protectors. Harsh, yes, but honest. She said the land doesn't hurt you unless you disrespect it first. But even she had one rule that never wavered. After dark, we stay inside, no exceptions. The town obeyed that rule collectively. As soon as twilight bruised the sky, doors were shut, curtains drawn, and porches left empty. Not out of superstition alone, but tradition, a learned behavior passed down like an heirloom no one asked for. I grew up idolizing the older kids in town. They were louder, braver, and carried a kind of confidence that isolation breeds. One evening, while pretending to help gather firewood behind the chapel, I overheard them planning to visit the Watchtower after midnight. They spoke in nervous dares, like kids trying to frighten fear itself. They didn't know I was listening, and I knew better than to reveal myself. I packed quietly that night. Snacks, gloves, a flashlight, and a wool scarf. My plan was embarrassingly simple. Follow them, prove myself, and be accepted. I left hours before they did, hiding under old farm equipment until I saw them slip past the church boundary. They didn't notice me trailing behind them as they entered the woods. The forest at night was a different universe. Air colder, silence louder, darkness thicker. A distant sound floated through the trees, low and wavering, rising and falling like a warped melody. It didn't sound like an animal. It didn't sound like weather. It sounded like a voice trying to remember how to be one. The others heard it too, but said nothing. Pride was steering the hike now, not curiosity. When we reached the ruin, they lit a small fire and began exploring the broken archways. That's when I saw her. A tall figure draped in black, face hidden behind a thin mesh veil, standing motionless beyond the tree line. She didn't approach, she didn't breathe visibly. She simply stood, humming the same broken melody, soft at first, then louder, overlapping itself unnaturally, like several voices trying to sing through one throat. Then
The humming twisted into something half song, half scream. The fire flickered violently as if reacting, not burning. The older kids panicked. They bolted instantly, dropping branches, bags, dignity, running like startled deer in separate directions. But I didn't run. I couldn't. The sound hit me like a physical force, locking my limbs, squeezing air from my lungs, pinning me inside my own body. My flashlight slipped from my hand. I fell to my knees, covering my ears, sobbing into the dirt, convinced the mountains themselves were singing through her. And then, silence. The sudden kind that makes your ears ache. She was gone. The fire still burned, but smaller now, ashamed. I walked home alone in the early hours, every shadow convincing me I had imagined nothing. I never told anyone I followed them. That morning, my mother found me shivering on the floor, still layered in cold weather clothes. She didn't ask what happened. She simply held my hand too tightly, like she already knew the mountains had finally spoken back. A week later, one of the older boys disappeared without explanation. No search party, no investigation, just absence. In towns like ours, sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see in the woods. It's what the woods decides to keep.
Some houses don't need ghosts to be frightening. Age alone can do the job. I was 12 when my family moved into a 2-story wooden home near the foothills of western North Carolina. Unlike the first town I grew up in, this one actually had a name and a post office, but not much else. The house used to belong to my grandfather. When he passed, it became ours by default, as if the mountain itself had decided who should inherit its silence next. During the day, the place was charming. Wildflowers, rusted barns, wind chimes my mother kept repairing even when the wind refused to cooperate. But at night, the house turned territorial. Every step announced itself. Every door exaggerated its hinges. The walls carried sound like a rumor it enjoyed repeating. My father traveled often for contract work, and my mother sometimes joined him when it was close enough to make sense. On this particular night, she did. They told me they'd be back before dawn, which was their polite way of saying, "Don't wait up." I nodded, like a kid who understood more than he did. In reality, I hated nights when the house got to be louder than people. I did what any nervous child does. I flooded the place with artificial courage. I turned on the porch light, the hall light, the stairwell light, even the bulb in rooms I hadn't stepped in for months. The house glowed like it was preparing for visitors it hadn't invited. Around 8:15 p.m., I made hot cocoa and sat with the TV playing an old wildlife documentary, not because I cared about mountain elk migration, but because the narrator's voice felt like company. The heater rattled, the roof clicked under temperature shifts, and for a while, it all felt normal enough to trust. Then the floorboard popped. Not the dramatic kind, just the familiar lazy creak of someone stepping on it lightly. The documentary was paused. The heater was humming. No storm that night, which meant only one thing. I wasn't alone. I convinced myself it was imagination at first. The mountains train your brain to see patterns where there should be none. But then I heard another step, slower this time, cautious, calculated. Someone was moving through the house like they already owned its blueprint. I walked into my father's study, the room he called his thinking nest. A desk, stacks of notebooks, and a stone-framed wood stove we no longer used. Beside it was an old storage compartment sealed by a warped oak plank. When I was smaller, I once discovered that behind the stove was a tight crawl space, intended for insulation access, not children, but small enough that a kid could disappear there if he tried hard enough. So I did. I slid the plank aside, squeezed in sideways, and resealed it from inside. It smelled of charcoal, cedar rot, and forgotten winter coats. My lungs burned from panic, not air loss. I heard movement, first upstairs, then descending, then circling the house interior without urgency. Whoever it was wasn't afraid of being discovered. That made it worse. A calm intruder is a confident one. I saw shadows move through the crack beneath the study door. Then the door opened. Footsteps entered, paused, shifted toward the stove, then stopped. The man was tall, boots wet at the edges, coat heavy, face hidden under a black cloth mask that swallowed the rest of his features. He bent slightly toward the stove, scanning like someone checking the last place he expected something valuable to be hidden. Me. Our eyes met through the crack. I braced for violence, screaming, anything, but instead he raised a gloved hand in a slow, deliberate motion and whispered, "Don't make a sound. Not tonight." Then he walked to the desk, rummaged briefly, and left the room without touching the stove again. That moment didn't calm me. It haunted me differently. Why warn me to stay silent if not to protect me from someone or something else? Minutes later, I heard tires grinding against gravel outside, followed by my mother's voice calling my name like a prayer she suddenly believed in again. My parents hadn't just come back. They came back frightened, which was a first for me to witness. My father's desk was overturned when they reached the study. Papers were missing. The plank beside the stove was shut again, making the fact that I had ever opened it a deception. I didn't speak for a long time, not out of secrecy, but because fear sometimes steals language before it steals sense. When I finally told them I heard footsteps, they assumed the rest without asking for details. The sheriff was called, not the police, not the state authorities. In towns like ours, law enforcement isn't a department, it's a person. And that person was already uncomfortable enough stepping into a case that involved a house older than his badge. No suspect was ever found. No motive was ever named. No explanation was ever offered. But the house changed after that. We installed new locks, motion lights, cameras, and a security system that constantly beeped like it needed reassurance, too. I eventually learned that the mountain doesn't always speak through voices in the woods. Sometimes it uses a floorboard, a mask, a warning, and a child who survives to retell it. And sometimes that warning is the scariest part of the story.
We lived on a farm that felt less like land and more like the end of something. No street name, no nearby gas station, no late-night traffic, just miles of climbing terrain that folded into deeper wilderness. I was 14 when it happened. By then, I thought I knew isolation. I later learned I only knew the comfortable version of it. Our farmhouse sat on a ridge in rural West Virginia. It was built before anyone in my family was born, its beams darkened by decades of winters, coal oil lamps, and thunderstorm seasons that hit like punishment. My parents raised livestock, grew corn, kept bees, and maintained the unspoken rule that every Appalachian child eventually memorizes. Night belongs to the mountains, not us. My younger sister, Leah, was 8 then. She had the fearless curiosity of someone still too young to understand fear. Her best friend, Mara, often stayed over when her parents worked weekend shifts. But that night felt different from the start, like a script the air already rehearsed. Earlier that evening, Mara arrived soaked from rain, smiling too easily for someone dripping on the porch. My mother greeted her warmly, but there was a pause in her expression. Small, barely detectable, but heavy enough to remember. She'd always trusted sleepovers, trusted neighbors, trusted the land. That hesitation was new. At 10:45 p.m., my father received a call from an unknown number. The voice claimed his work truck had been sideswiped near the railway depot and that roadside assistance wouldn't arrive until morning. Whoever it was insisted someone had to come verify ownership before they could tow it. It was nonsense, but the storm outside made nonsense feel believable. My mother grabbed her coat and car keys. The rain smudged the headlights into shaky white swords slicing through fog. Before leaving, she locked every door, double-checked the windows, and kissed us like she was trying to memorize our faces in case the night demanded memory later. The moment her car rolled downhill, Mara stood at the kitchen window and whispered, "He's here early." I asked what she meant. She answered without turning, family always checks in before midnight. That's when we heard the first hit. A slow metallic click against the back door latch, then another. Someone was testing entry points without urgency, like a person who didn't fear getting caught, only feared leaving empty-handed. I pulled Leah behind me, but Mara stepped forward, barefoot, walking toward the hallway like she was greeting someone on a schedule. Leah started crying. I moved fast, faster than panic allows clarity. I grabbed Mara's arm before she reached the handle. She erupted into screaming, not terror, betrayal, like I was blocking a long-awaited arrival. My sister flinched. Mara thrashed. I yelled for Leah to help, and through tears and confusion, she did. Together, we pulled Mara backward and locked her in my room. Then came the laughter. Not from her, from outside. A low, amused chuckle that didn't belong to weather or children. Someone had entered through the basement window, the only unreinforced part of the house. The sound of boots climbed the stairs, wet and heavy, followed by slow breathing, patient and unshaken. Leah whispered through sobs, "Why is she excited?" I answered honestly, I don't think she was waiting for help. We hid in the bathroom, the sturdiest door in the house, reinforced with iron bolts meant to keep bears out, not men in masks. Then we heard the bedroom door slam. Mara started laughing from inside, hysterical, rhythmic, manic, delighted, too delighted for survival to make sense. Something heavy crashed against the wood stove in my parents' room. He wasn't trying to reach us first. He was trying to reach her. That distraction saved us, not because distraction is merciful, but because it is practical. I heard sirens winding up the ridge, distorted by rain until they felt unreal. But when the bathroom door finally broke open, it was officers, not family, not folklore, not mountain judgment. My parents had called them. They explained later that when they arrived at the railway depot, my father's truck was fine, but the tires had been slashed clean through. That made them suspicious enough to assume the worst and call authorities before returning. They saved us without knowing exactly what they were saving us from. Mara was taken away for a psychiatric evaluation that same night. Her parents vanished from town soon after. Weeks later, a masked man matching the description was killed during a convenience store robbery in central Pennsylvania. But no one ever confirmed if he worked alone or if Mara truly knew him. What frightened me most wasn't the attack. It was this realization. Some children aren't protected by the night. Some are recruited by it. And some mountains don't whisper warnings, they file visitor logs. I never saw Mara again, but every winter when storms hit the ridge, I still remember the sound of calm breathing in a house full of screaming, and a girl walking barefoot toward a door she was never meant to open. The mountains where I grew up weren't scenic postcards. They were tall, quiet judges covered in trees. Our town sat along the border of northern Georgia and southern Tennessee, squeezed into a valley locals nicknamed Black Pine Basin. It wasn't named for tourism, it was named for truth. The pine trees there grew so densely that sunlight had to negotiate its way through branches like a visitor asking for permission. My family lived in one of the oldest houses in the area, a two-story farmhouse with faded green shutters and a wraparound porch that no one used past evening. My grandparents built it long before the county got paved roads, back when kerosene lanterns were emergency technology, not decoration. Even as a kid, I could tell the house carried stories the way old fabric carries smoke. My parents ran a small produce business. Most days it was peaches, apples, wild honey, and homemade preserves. On weekends, we set up a roadside stand at the bottom of the ridge. People came for the fruit, but they stayed for the conversations, weather predictions, church announcements, and the occasional missing person rumor spoken softly enough not to spoil the sales. Because out there, fear wasn't dramatic, it was polite. We had a rule at home that doubled as town policy: no wandering outside after the evening bells. There were no actual bells, of course, but when dusk fully arrived, it felt like a signal ringing through the air, a shared understanding that the human shift was over and the mountain shift was beginning. I was 13 when I broke the rule, Not rebelliously, but embarrassingly. I was chasing acceptance. The older kids in town had started daring each other to hike up Black Pine Ridge at night. They swore something strange flickered near the old mining trail, an abandoned route that once led to coal pits sealed after a collapse decades earlier. No signs, no barricades. The ridge handled its own warnings. One Friday, I trailed them quietly from a distance, carrying a small battery flashlight and a rusted hand-me-down lantern I found in the barn. It barely worked, but it made me feel older, braver, chosen. Halfway up the ridge, a fog rolled in. Not cinematic mist, but thick gray wool that swallowed direction. The older kids froze, staring ahead at a faint yellow glow bobbing in the trees. My lantern began flickering in response, its flame jerking like it recognized the other light as competition. Then came the singing. Soft, unsteady, ancient. The melody wasn't sad or angry. It sounded homesick for a mouth that no longer existed. The older kids scattered immediately, stumbling downhill, pride dissolving into panic. I tried to run too, but the fog felt heavier around me, like the mountain had placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Not you, stay." The singing grew louder, the yellow glow drifted closer, and when the fog shifted just enough for shape to appear, I saw a figure holding a lantern that burned too steadily to be fire, too warmly to be natural, and too personally to be coincidence. I don't remember her face, not because it was hidden, but because my brain refused to record it. I remember dropping the lantern. I remember falling backward into wet pine needles. I remember crying without sound, like sound itself had been temporarily suspended. And then it stopped. No fade out, no footsteps leaving, just an abrupt ending, like a record needle lifting itself. When I finally reached home near morning, my clothes smelled like cold earth and extinguished matches. My mother found me sitting on the porch steps, shaking, the way you shake when your body knows more than your words can explain. She didn't scold me. She only said, "Some lights don't guide you home. Some lights check if you belong there." 2 months later, a volunteer search crew found an old lantern on the mining trail, the exact model my grandfather used to carry. The wick was burned out, but the glass wasn't broken. No one knew how it got there. But I did. I never told the ridge I was sorry. You don't apologize to judges. You survive them quietly and hope your name never makes the visitor list again.
The Appalachian woods don't roar. They remember. We lived in Singing Creek Hollow, a small settlement in southwest Virginia, where the forest felt like part of the family tree. My mother inherited our farmhouse from her father, a quiet man who carved his beliefs into routine rather than sermons. The house sat on a hillside above a slow-moving creek, surrounded by maple trees, thorn bushes, and barns older than the county's zoning laws. The nights there weren't dark because of the sky. They were dark because the trees finished the job. My father worked long hours at a sawmill in the next county over. My mother managed the farm, the books, and the fragile ecosystem of keeping 2 kids fed and 1 house standing. I was 15 then, old enough to lift hay bales, young enough to believe bravery was a currency. My little brother, Noah, was 9. He was the kind of kid who asked questions the world didn't want to answer. One night, as we were shutting the windows against an approaching storm, he said something that felt like a pebble dropped into still water. "Do you think the woods ever listens to us?" I laughed it off, but my mother didn't. She paused just long enough for silence to have a shadow. It started raining at 11:17 p.m., the kind of rain that sounds like fingers drumming on the roof when everyone else is asleep. I was awake, scrolling on my cracked screen phone, when I heard something underneath the storm, a rhythm with intention. A knock at the door. 3 slow taps, a long pause, then 2 more. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't hesitant. It sounded like someone practicing patience as a warning. I grabbed the shotgun my father kept mounted above the pantry door.
Not because I planned to shoot, but because metal in your hands feels like courage borrowed from adulthood. My mother stepped out of her room seconds later, already dressed in boots and a coat. She moved like someone responding to a history she never told us. I told her to stay back. She ignored me with experience. Through the rain-blurred window, we saw a man standing on the porch. His coat was dark, soaked through, hood pulled low. His posture was too relaxed for someone caught in weather this brutal. My mother whispered, "He's not lost. Lost people look around. He already knows the view." I asked who it was. She said she didn't know his name. That was the problem. The knock came again. Same rhythm, same spacing, same unsettling courtesy. Noah started crying from behind me. The man didn't react to the sound, which meant the sound wasn't new to him. Then he spoke, voice calm enough to survive the storm. "Just checking in. No trouble. No introduction. No reason. No warmth. Just an announcement." My mother called the police while I kept the gun aimed at the floor, realizing for the first time that a weapon doesn't make you brave, it only makes you responsible for the ending. The officers arrived 18 minutes later. When they stepped onto the porch, the man was gone. Not fading into fog, not sprinting into legend, just gone, like a sentence erased before the ink dried. The officers checked the perimeter, the barns, the creek bed, the dirt trail leading uphill. Nothing. No tracks, no cigarette butts, no disturbed mud. One officer said something I will never forget. "Out here, the scariest stories don't leave evidence, they leave corrections." That night I finally understood my mother's silence earlier. The woods had listened to us, and it had answered in a language that didn't need sound. We didn't sleep for days, not because of the man, but because the house felt heavier afterward, like awareness itself had moved in and put its boots by the door. And every night since, when storms hit the hollow, we still lock the doors, not out of fear of what knocks, but out of respect for the quiet things that don't need to.